the floor is open. So raise your hand, and when you make a question or a comment, please be brief. And before you ask, questions or comments, please identify yourself and please let them know, where your questions are, directed to. So, any questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jenna Gibson. I'm at the University of Chicago, PhD student. My question is actually for Dr. Kim. I find it really interesting. I don't study education at all, but I'm really interested in your work. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot being here in Korea for the summer is Songdo and the international schools that have been built out there in the last few years. From my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, part of the motivation was to encourage more foreign students to study abroad in Korea. But from what I understand, it maybe hasn't worked exactly as they planned, or maybe it's smaller than they wanted it to eventually be. So I'm curious if you've done any research on that specifically.
Okay. I will collect, some questions. Yes, Taylor.
Hello, my name is Taylor. I'm a graduate student at GSIS, and this is for Dr. Katz. I was just wondering what role you see China playing in the current Japan-Korea issues, if they're going to be a responsible stakeholder in the region and try to downplay it or soothe the tensions, or if they're going to try to exploit the tensions between these two U.S. allies. Thank you.
Interesting. Role of China, not U.S. Hyungjun.
Hi, I'm Hyungjun from the University of Chicago. I have a question for Professor Ko. It's always a pleasure to hear about your ongoing research. So I wanted to ask you a question. So your research essentially proposes a conditional hypothesis wherein nationalism becomes a force for conflict only to the extent that leaders believe in the probability of complete or decisive victory. For me, an interesting obverse of this hypothesis is that low-level conflicts might be more likely when nationalist agitation is at lower levels, because the public is then more willing to accept partial or piecemeal victories or gains. So can you say a few words about whether you see such dynamics in your research, in your empirical investigations? One interesting counterintuitive policy implication of this is that actually leaders who are interested in managing escalation, de-escalation, who are interested in peace, might actually have an interest under some circumstances in actually stymieing, bolstering nationalism, right? Is that too much of a stretch of an inference to draw from your research? Or do you see actually some of these dynamics at work in your empirical investigations? Thank you.
Thank you. I will take one more question for the first round. Yes. Microphone.
I'm a master's student at KU GSIS, and I have a question for Dr. Young. My question was, what kind of relations and how strong the relations between third world countries and the North Korea have, and if the relations are strong enough, as you said, is it gonna influence the effectiveness of the sanctions against North Korea? And if that's the case, will there be any chance that North Korea just kind of abandons its efforts to build a peaceful relations with South Korea and the US and just focus on its relations, its economic or diplomatic or cultural relations with third world countries?
Okay, so I will give the floor to Stephanie Kim first, and then Katz, Ko, and Young.
Thank you so much for your question. It's actually a really great question, and I'm glad you asked. So you're right. The rationale of building a place like Songdo was to provide an infrastructure to accommodate international students. And so, the rationale is if you build it, they will come. And it was happening alongside various government policies like the Study Korea project, with a goal of getting international students studying in South Korea up to 200,000. So in terms of building up the international infrastructure, there were the English language campus settings, more EMI classes. In many cases, some of these schools have, quote unquote, imported foreign scholars from overseas to teach in English at these campuses. And I've written in my work that while it does attract international students to South Korea, what it also does in conjunction is re-attract Korean students who might already be overseas or who might otherwise go overseas from a domestic market. And I've called this phenomenon reverse student mobility. I've published a paper on it and I'm happy to share it with you. And in this sense, it forces us to think of internationalization efforts in higher education as counterintuitively anti-internationalization, because it effectively retains or reverses the flow of students across national borders, if that's how we define internationalization in higher education traditionally. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Katz?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the role of China. I think it's a really interesting and important part of this. I'm not sure if this was your question, but I certainly don't think China is going to try to reconcile Japan and South Korea, primarily because strategically it really likes it when Japan and South Korea fight. Seeing, U.S. allies, the others, third part of the triangle not working out is quite good strategically for China as well as North Korea. In this case, they also might benefit economically, further on down the line. There's speculation that China could be a new supplier for the products that South Korea would no longer be getting from Japan. So it's a double whammy effect of not really helping things in terms of reconciliation. Interestingly, though, also right now, Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping are in a more warm phase than in the past. So that would also complicate, I guess. Not complicate, but they seem to be doing quite well at sitting back right now. Historically, it's not been constant like that, though. I mean, generally, South Korea and China have been on the same side of the history issues. So we've seen times in the past when, like Park Geun-hye's time, for instance, when China was also fighting with Japan over the same historical issues. So there's variation there, but generally, I think they wouldn't see, at least in our current world, a role to actually ease tensions because it can be quite good for them. So.
Thank you. Dr. Kwok?
Thank you for a really interesting question. I guess India-Pakistan diet may be like the one that shows like high nationalism can be correlated with like frequent like low level of conflicts. But I think even in the case, if you look at, those cases, usually these crises are driven by like private actors or like a military level initiative, not at the like leader level. So if leaders believe that there is no, high chance of like winning in a war, then it's better for them to avoid like low level conflicts. So because there's like still like a chance of escalation, and then it is more costly for leaders to cool down popular nationalism once like low level disputes take place. So I think like at their will, like leaders are still unlikely to play leaders even if leaders want to play a nationalism card, still it's very likely that they want to avoid even low level disputes if they are not confident about the chance of winning.
Okay. Young?
So in regards to how North Korea treats the third world now, it's been a substantial shift. I think there's two key events that kind of signal that. Is that a few years ago, North Korean hackers stole over $100 million from the Central Bank of Bangladesh, and they specifically targeted Bangladesh because their security measures are weaker than a lot of developed countries. And I think it was like 2 years ago when North Korean agents helped to plan an attack on Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia's international airport with a WMD grade nerve agent. You don't do these two events to countries that you see as allies. So North Korea, they still have rhetoric that talks about solidarity with anti-imperialist countries, but there's really only a few that they still regard as allies. One is Cuba. Cuba-North Korea relations are still very strong. Venezuela, and also a couple of regimes in Africa. But overall, I think North Korea now thinks of the third world as an opportunity to undermine political rivals, whether it's South Korea or whether it's internal enemies that are a threat to the ruling elite. And this shift actually really began under Kim Jong-il with the bombing in 1983 in Burma. Kim Jong-il he reversed what Kim Il-sung had a revolutionary duty to help out third world movements and third world governments. But under Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un, it's substantially different.
Okay, thank you very much. Second round, briefly. Are there any undergraduate students? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, yes. Privilege.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to pose a question, and I have a question for Dr. Young. And I'm majoring in cultural tourism, so I do not know nearly any about this field. But what made me interested was that you mentioned mass game as a cultural diplomacy. So I would like to know how North Korea is doing some cultural diplomacy towards some African countries, which are kind of corrupted, or the third world you mentioned.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any others? Yes.
My name is Young Jae. I'm in the master's program at the political science department here at Korea University. My question is to Dr. Ko. So you mentioned the part about the cooling down effect of nationalism and how regimes, especially in authoritarian regimes, they actually use methods such as media control, which got me thinking to maybe China and Japan in the early 2000s when there was the arson of the embassy. But in 2019, I was thinking, is this mechanism effective? So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on the effectiveness of this media control to cool down nationalism, and if it does really work as a cool down mechanism.
Okay. Any questions on the other side? Yes.
Nice to meet you. I'm Jung Kim. I'm in the master degrees course at GSIS. I want to ask Professor Cha. I read the Impossible State impressively and read the article that Professor mentioned that the talks in Panmunjom is kind of reality show. Well, I think it is a problem that the summit couldn't make any progress and has repeated certain pattern until now. In my humble opinion, it comes from a disagreement of needs. What the North Korea really wants is the survival of leaders, honestly. But the United States can give is just economic assurance. So please let me know what you think. It could be very helpful for my thesis proposal.
Okay. Is there anybody who cannot go to sleep without making any questions? Yes.
Hello, I'm also a student here at KU GSIS. Maybe my question is directed to Dr. Katz. Security Council sanctions have been there since maybe North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, but I guess recent sanctions restricting North Korean exports of coal and imports of oil had more effect on North Korean economy and the regime itself, and also China's participation in the sanctions regime. So I want to hear your opinion on what the motivations of China's participation in the sanctions regime may be, and up to what degree China will participate in the regime as well.
Okay. In the rear seat. Yes. No. You raise your hand, right? He raised it. But you gave up? You passed?
No, we both raised them.
Oh, okay. So, first come, first serve.
Hello, I have a question for Dr. Kim. I'm an undergraduate student at Stanford, and as a student studying abroad, international student studying abroad, I had a question of, so you mentioned how the institutions are using international students' paid tuition to cover for their budget, but I'm also interested in how the United States promotes their soft power through high elite education, because I think that the United States is unparalleled in promoting sort of a high elite education by attracting students from around the globe. So I'm interested in how that sort of links to soft power.
Okay, good question. Okay, next to him.
Hi, my name is Choi Hyun Bin. I'm an undergraduate student here in Korea University. My question is, if I may, I have two questions. One is directed to Dr. Katz, and the other is directed to Dr. Scott. For Dr. Katz, I was wondering if, by my understanding, I'm not an expert, but from my studies, the conflict patterns in Northeast Asia seems to be changing because for the majority of the patterns, South Korea has been more on the more anti-Japan rhetoric, but then now Japan is also turning to anti-South Korea rhetoric. So I wonder if that could be part of the patterns that are changing in Northeast Asia, and what are your thoughts about it? And for Dr. Scott, cybersecurity issues are becoming a very important aspect of interstate warfare, interstate conflict, and I'm not sure if you are an expert on the Korean side of things, but I was wondering if you have any knowledge, if you could explain what you think about how ready South Korea is in the case of an all-scale, hypothetically speaking, very large-scale North Korean attack on South Korean networks. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, Dr. Young.
All right, I'm going to do this very briefly. Thanks for your question. So North Korea, the mass games collaboration really ended in the mid-1990s. North Korea just simply ran out of money, and they still don't really have a lot of money, and they don't really want to devote it too much to cultural diplomacy with African countries. But what they do now is they set up Juche study institutions, Juche study groups in Africa, and they use this for domestic propaganda purposes, just saying, oh, you know, our leaders are really revered around the world, blah, blah, blah. But it's very, it's for all extensive purposes, it's pretty shallow and superficial, and sometimes they even just pay locals to come to their Juche study groups. I found some evidence of that. So right now, I mean, South Korea, its soft power is a million times greater than North Korea's. But I think there is still kind of this anti-colonial solidarity with North Korea. It is still kind of in the background, but you can't compete with BTS.
Okay, Dr. Ko.
Thank you for your question. Let me briefly illustrate like how the Chinese government used the media control in 2012. So, nationalist protests occurred like in more than 100 cities in China, but almost no Chinese newspapers posted like photos of protests. And before like popular nationalism was on the rise, the main Chinese state media covered the Diaoyu Senkaku issue for like 40 hours per week. But after like nationalist protests started to spread across the country, the Chinese government cut down the media coverage to up to like 5 hours per week. So that dramatically like changed the people's attention, and also at the same time, the Chinese government increased to like think about more like a mature patriotism to their citizens through their media. So yeah, that's the way that how the Chinese government controlled and it was trying to cool down popular nationalism.
Okay, Scott.
Sure. In terms of large-scale attacks, some of this is threat model that for almost anyone who has persistent access through to another country, you get much more value out of having the surveillance and view of it than you do shutting it down. Right? Especially if your motive here is profit, not just disruption. So most people, when they're thinking about a large scale like disruption, that happens much more from squirrels or animals than from a cyber attacker. I think, from what I've seen, South Korea is as prepared as anyone for major disruption attacks.
Dr. Kim?
So thank you for your question, and actually that's a very good point. And yes, certainly there's a soft power element to this, and so different from the institutional level, which is primarily about the bottom line, on a nation-state level, in many respects it is about soft power. And so from the US side of it, there are programs to promote soft power via international education opportunities, the most famous of them being the Fulbright program, to bring in international students to the US and send US students outward to countries. These programs are also very much dependent on the priorities of whatever administration is currently holding court, and unfortunately, in this current moment, that doesn't seem to be a very high priority at the moment. What I actually find quite interesting is that the soft power priority is also happening on the South Korean side. And so you see this through Korean studies funding mechanisms like the Korea Foundation, 한국국제교육위원단, and the Academy of Korean Studies, the 중앙, I forget the Korean name, 한국중앙연구원. Okay. And so these are, I find very interesting because they fund the study of Korea primarily to overseas scholars and to overseas institutions. And in many respects, you can also look at that as a form of soft power taking place on the South Korean side.
Okay, Dr. Katz, briefly.
Okay. On this sanctions question, I mean, it's not directly related to my work, but it's something I've thought about. I think, China, yes, was a very big supporter of the maximum pressure campaign, and that was very significant. Maximum pressure, of course, still exists in terms of sanctions, but 2017 was the peak kind of cooperation phase for China. I saw it's because their interest in stability. That was the least stable time in terms of dynamics with North Korea. Its enforcement of those sanctions is, its incentives to enforce them go down, maybe not doing it overtly, but go down once tensions have eased and the situation stabilized. It's a very brief, I guess, response to that. On the conflict patterns question, that's a really good insight and something that, definitely, it problematically does seem to be true. And what it brings to mind is that the iterated patterns don't repeat the exact same way every time. It shows that over time, things actually do change internally, and in Japan, I think there has been, as you noted, increase in anti-South Korea sentiment over time because of the very repetition of many of these same disputes. My way of thinking about that, though, is that I don't see it as a particular driver of the current dynamics. It's important, but my sense is that there's still more of a relative ambivalence on the Japanese side about this issue compared to South Korea, and that if that were the only change, we wouldn't be seeing, this blurring of, broader, the hot economical politics. To me, the bigger driver of that change really has to do with the U.S. injecting strategic uncertainty into the region, as well as new tactics. I don't think Japan would have tried these tactics if the U.S. hadn't kind of weaponized trade in its own way. So.
Okay. Yeah, I know. But together with your final word. Okay, before I give the floor to Victor, Professor Ishinoa, do you have any word as a senior advisor for this program?
Well, I thought
within 30 seconds.
As an old professor, I have no chance to talk today. But I think I will see you guys in the dinner, and I have several comments and questions. So why don't I save it so that I just give a chance to Cha?
Okay, Victor.
First, just to answer the question quickly, Impossible State is a great book, I heard. Yeah. In terms of the question of security guarantees, I mean, as you know well, you can look at security guarantees is external security guarantees, which the United States has given many times to North Korea. The most recent iteration on paper was the one that George W. Bush gave, which is that the United States will not attack North Korea with nuclear or conventional weapons, right? A negative security assurance. But that's not the security guarantee that the regime wants. They want the internal security guarantee, and that, of course, is very difficult for any country to give. I think it would be interesting if someone did a study and looked at whether there's ever been a case in history where an autocratic leader accepted a security guarantee from a security patron, an allied patron, and was satisfied with it. Because my guess is the answer is no, because of the nature of the regime itself. I mean, just think how democratic allies never feel comfortable even with a security guarantee from an ally, like South Korea and the United States. And this is a relatively transparent relationship, so it's infinitely harder. The interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he seems to be trying to replace the notion of an internal security guarantee with the building of some sort of trust with the North Korean leader through these constant meetings and platitudes and things of that nature, which I find ironic, because if there's anybody in the world that I would not trust, this is all being filmed, if there's anybody in the world that I would not trust, it would be you-know-who. So with that, I want to thank Professor Kim, Professor Lee, and all of you for taking the time. I thought it was an excellent discussion. Your questions were really excellent, really, all of you, and this was, to me at least, certainly the highlight we've had of the past day and a half.
Thank you, Victor. I think we have had a very interesting discussions. As we had expected, we have a really exciting session. I personally believe U.S.-Korea, Korea-U.S. relationship is like a human being who needs to be regularly fed, should be educated, and go to the hospital for regular checkup to live longer. In that sense, I'm pretty confident, U.S.-Korea, Korea-U.S. NextGen scholars will contribute to making this bilateral alliance relationship to move to a better direction. So on that optimistic note, let me adjourn this session. I propose to give these excellent, NextGen scholars a big round of applause.